My son told me I wasn't welcome for Christmas because I would ruin the aesthetic of his $4 million glass and steel monument to vanity. He stared at my worn canvas jacket and my grease-stained hands as if I were a smudge on a pristine window. He thought I was just a retired factory supervisor living out his twilight years on a meager pension and a fading memory of a late wife. He forgot who I was. He forgot that I didn't just build his life. I owned the very ground his aesthetic was built upon. That night, as the Connecticut snow began to fall, I made a single phone call. By the time the sun rose, my son wouldn't just be looking for a new place to host his party. He would be looking for a way to survive the collapse of everything he thought he knew. My name is Arthur Sterling, and I am 70 years old. The engine of my 15-year-old Ford F-Muttrumnummi hummed with a low, reliable growl as I turned off the main thoroughfare and onto the private, heated cobblestone roads of Oak Ridge Estates. This wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a gated fortress for the ultra-wealthy of Greenwich. To everyone living behind these manicured hedges, I was an eyesore. I was the poverty-stricken father who lived in a two-bedroom bungalow on the wrong side of the tracks, a man who still changed his own oil and wore boots that had seen more miles than most of these people had walked in their lives. It was a perfect cover. It had been my reality for nearly 2 decades. I was on my way to see my son, Julian. He's 42, my only child, and a man who had spent the last decade carefully erasing every trace of the blue-collar blood in his veins. Today was my granddaughter Penelope's 8th birthday, falling just a few days before the grand Christmas gala Julian and his wife were hosting. In the passenger seat, protected by a heavy wool blanket, sat her gift. It wasn't a plastic piece of junk from a big box store or a digital tablet that would be obsolete in a year. I had spent 6 months in my workshop, often until 3 in the morning, crafting a muy high-scale replica of the first home I ever shared with my late wife, Eleanor. It was a miniature labor of love. I had hand-carved every cedar shingle. I had used a jeweler's saw to create the tiny, intricate lattice work on the porch. I had even sourced reclaimed oak to match the exact grain of the floors Eleanor and I had danced on 40 years ago. It was more than a toy. It was a piece of our history. I didn't know it yet, but that little house was the last piece of my heart I would ever try to give to that family. I pulled into Julian's driveway. His house was a born-for Heimudola million brutalist masterpiece, lots of right angles, floor-to-ceiling glass, and white marble that looked as cold as a morgue. The driveway was already a sea of silver and black. Range Rovers, Porsches, and a brand new Bentley that probably cost more than my first 3 houses combined. My rusted Ford looked like a piece of debris that had drifted into a pristine harbor. I could hear the party from the street. Not the sound of children playing, but the sophisticated, hollow clinking of crystal and the practiced laughter of people who valued status over soul. I hopped out, the cold Atlantic wind biting at my neck, and carefully lifted the heavy dollhouse. My knees popped a reminder of 40 years on a factory floor, but I didn't mind. I was thinking of Penelope's face. She was the only reason I ever stepped foot in this sterile museum. I rang the bell. It was a silent, haptic chime that sent a notification to a smartphone. A moment later, the massive pivot door swung open. Julian stood there. He looked like he'd been plucked from the pages of a high-end fashion magazine. A navy cashmere sweater, tailored trousers, and hair that cost more to maintain than my monthly grocery bill. For a fleeting second, he looked like the boy I used to take fishing. But then his eyes dropped. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my boots. Then he looked past me at my truck. His face didn't just fall. It twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated embarrassment. "Dad?" he whispered, stepping out onto the porch and pulling the door nearly shut behind him, as if he were trying to hide a shameful secret. "What are you doing here?" "The party is." "It's a private event, Dad." "It's Penelope's birthday, Julian," I said, my voice sounding older and gravelly compared to the smooth, rehearsed tones of the party behind him. "You called me last week. You said to drop by." I brought her gift. I shifted the weight of the dollhouse, showing him the hand-painted blue shutters. Finished it just in time. Julian didn't even glance at the gift. He looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. "Dad, listen. Today is a business social. Vivienne's parents are here, along with the partners from the firm. It's high stakes. I'm her grandfather, Julian. I'm not a business prospect. I just want to see the look on her face when she sees the house." Before he could respond, the door swung wide. Vivienne Montgomery Sterling stepped out. She was 40, sculpted by surgeons and fueled by ambition. Her white silk dress flowed like liquid, and her eyes sharp as diamonds swept over me with a clinical coldness. She didn't see a father-in-law. She saw a liability. "Julian," she said, her voice a low, lethal hum. "I thought we discussed the guest list. The Harrisons just arrived, and they're asking about the vintage truck blocking the caterer's entrance." She looked at me, then at the dollhouse. She didn't even hide the sneer. "Is that wood?" "It's going to get sawdust on the rug, Julian. Get him to leave. Now. My parents are flying in from London tonight for the Christmas gala, and I will not have the aesthetic ruined. This is $1 million brand we are building here. Deal with it." She didn't wait for a reply. She turned her back on us, the heavy door clicking shut with a sound that felt final. I stood there in the cold, the wind whistling between the glass pillars. Julian wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at his Numtrum Dola loafers. He was a 42-year-old man, a power player in the city, and he was absolutely terrified of a woman in a silk dress. "Dad," he mumbled, his voice thin. "She's right. About the aesthetic. This party. It's for people who move in different circles. And Christmas. Look, we've decided to keep it inner circle, only this year. Vivienne's family, the investors. It's a black tie affair. You'd be uncomfortable. It's probably best if you just stay home this year. We'll send Penelope's thank you note in the mail." The words didn't hurt. Not exactly. It was more like a sudden, profound silence. The kind of silence that happens right before a mountain collapses. I looked at the dollhouse, 6 months of my life, my memories of Eleanor, my sweat, and my love. "The aesthetic," I repeated quietly. "It's just business, Dad," Julian said, gaining a bit of his arrogant edge back now that the rejection was out. "You wouldn't understand. You spent your life in a factory. We're playing a different game. You're just not a fit for the Sterling brand anymore." He reached out, not to hug me, but to nudge the dollhouse. "And honestly, take that thing with you. It doesn't match her room. She's into digital interfaces now, not whatever this is." I looked at my son, and for the first time in my life, I didn't see my flesh and blood. I saw a hollowed-out shell filled with someone else's expectations. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, crystalline clarity. "I understand perfectly, Julian," I said. My voice was no longer gravelly. It was the voice I hadn't used in 15 years, the voice that used to make CEOs sweat in boardroom meetings. "The aesthetic is everything. Glad you see it that way. Sorry about the timing," he said, already retreating toward the warmth of his glass cage. I didn't say another word. I walked back to my truck, my steps steady. I didn't look back. I put the Ford in gear and drove away from the multi-million-dollar monument. Julian thought I was a poor man. He thought I was a burden. He thought I was a relic of a past he had outgrown. He had forgotten who taught him how to walk. And he was about to learn that when a Sterling decides to move, the earth shakes. I didn't drive back to my bungalow. I drove south, toward the industrial docks of the Stamford waterfront. I pulled up to a massive, windowless brick building that looked like an abandoned textile mill. There were no signs, no logos, just a rusted steel gate with a high-end biometric scanner hidden in a fake electrical box. I rolled down the window and pressed my thumb against the glass. A soft green light scanned my print. The heavy gate slid open with a silent, hydraulic hiss. I parked the truck among the shadows of the warehouse and walked to a side door. Inside, the air was climate-controlled and smelled of ozone and expensive leather. I walked past a row of dormant machinery and into a freight elevator. I punched a code into a hidden keypad behind the emergency panel. The elevator descended, not up, but down. When the doors opened, I wasn't in a factory. I was in a command center. A wall of monitors hummed with real-time global shipping data, stock tickers, and satellite feeds. A man in a sharp gray suit stood up from a desk. This was Thaddeus Vance, my lead counsel, and the only man on earth who knew the truth. "Arthur," Thaddeus said, his voice respectful. "I wasn't expecting you until the new year. Is everything all right?" I walked to the center of the room and looked at the monitors. I looked at the Sterling Vance logo glowing on the screens, the logistics empire that moved Bournemouth Fun Trum of the freight on the eastern seaboard. The empire I had retired from to live a quiet life, leaving it in a blind trust while I played the role of a simple man. "The aesthetic is ruined, Thaddeus," I said, my eyes cold. Thaddeus frowned. "I don't follow. My son thinks I'm a ghost. He thinks I'm a liability to his brand. He and his wife just told me I'm not welcome at Christmas because I'd ruined the look of their home." I turned to him, the home I bought for them through a shell company. The home they think they're paying a mortgage on. Thaddeus leaned back. You want to pull the plug? I want to do more than pull the plug, I said, my voice like a falling guillotine. I want a full audit of every cent I've gifted them. I want the mortgage called in. And Thaddeus? I want to know why Julian's firm has been sniffing around our private equity accounts. I think my son has been trying to rob a poor old man while he was busy kicking him off his porch. I looked at the primary monitor. He wants an aesthetic Christmas? Let's give him one. Start the reclamation. By the time the tree is lit, I want them to realize that the only thing they truly own is the clothes on their backs. And the dollhouse, Arthur? Thaddeus asked softly. Keep it here, I said, looking at the gift in the back of my truck through the security feed. It's the last thing I'll ever build for a family that no longer exists. I didn't know it yet, but my son wasn't just a snob. He was a thief. And the hole he had dug for himself was much deeper than I could have ever imagined. The drive back to my small bungalow in the shadows of the old rail yard felt different this time. For 15 years, this house had been my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without the suffocating weight of a billion-dollar legacy. I had lived here by choice, embracing the silence, the simple routine of the workshop, and the anonymity of a man who had already won the race. But as the headlights of my truck cut through the swirling Connecticut sleet, the house no longer looked like a sanctuary. It looked like a staging ground. I stepped inside and didn't bother turning on the lights. I knew every creak in these floorboards. I sat at my small kitchen table, the one where Julian used to sit as a teenager, complaining about his homework while Eleanor made him cocoa. I had tried so hard to give him a normal life. I thought that by hiding the sheer, staggering scale of our wealth, I was saving his soul. I thought that by letting him struggle a little, by making him earn his way through law school, even if I was secretly paying the tuition through anonymous scholarships, I was building a man of character. I was a fool. I hadn't built a man, I had built a facade. The silence was broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of my civilian phone on the countertop. I looked at the screen. Julian. I didn't pick up. I didn't need to hear his voice, the practiced, patronizing tone he used when he wanted to sound like the successful son checking in on his aging father. He was likely calling to make sure I wasn't confused about the directions away from his house, or perhaps Vivian had reminded him to ensure I didn't try to show up on Christmas Eve anyway. Instead, I went to the basement. I pushed aside a heavy workbench, revealing a floor safe bolted into the foundation. I keyed in the sequence Eleanor's birthday and pulled out a sleek, encrypted laptop. This wasn't for logistics. This was for the family office, the private entity that managed the Sterling Bloodline's assets. I logged into the secure portal for Apex Servicing, the shell company Thaddeus and I had created 10 years ago. To Julian and Vivienne, Apex was a mid-tier mortgage lender based out of Delaware. To me, it was a leash. I brought up the file for the Oak Ridge property. Julian thought he was a self-made man because he had qualified for a $5 million mortgage with a respectable interest rate. In reality, he hadn't qualified for anything. His credit score at the time had been a disaster, the result of a failed lifestyle brand startup he'd launched in his 20s, using money he'd essentially bullied out of his mother before she died. I had stepped in, invisible as always. I had bought the house in cash through a holding company, then sold it to Julian through Apex Servicing. Every month, he sent a check for $12,000 to a P.O. box in Wilmington. He thought he was building equity. In truth, he was just paying me rent for a house I already owned, and I was diverting every penny of that mortgage into a shielded trust for Penelope. I began to dig into the recent payment history. Something caught my eye. The last 3 payments hadn't come from Julian's personal account. They had been wired from a corporate entity called Viridian Alpha Holdings. I didn't recognize the name. I opened a second window and ran a deep trace search through the Sterling Vance private database. My heart hammered against my ribs as the results populated. Viridian Alpha was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. Its primary activity, high-risk speculative trading. And the authorized signatory, Julian Sterling. I felt a cold sweat prickle my hairline. Julian was a senior partner at a prestigious estate law firm. He dealt with trusts, wills, and the generational wealth of some of the oldest families in New England. He had no business running a Cayman-based trading shell. "What have you done, Julian?" I whispered into the dark room. I reached for the secure line and dialed Thaddeus. He answered before the first ring finished. "Arthur, I was just about to call you. I've been running the preliminary audit on the gifts you mentioned." "Forget the gifts for a second, Thaddeus. Look into Viridian Alpha Holdings. It's a Cayman shell. Julian's using it to pay his mortgage. There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear the rapid-fire clicking of keys. Found it, Thaddeus said, his voice dropping an octave. Arthur, this isn't good. Viridian Alpha isn't just a trading shell. It's been receiving massive, irregular inflows of cash over the last 6 months. Inflows from... Oh God. From where, Thaddeus? From the Harrington Estate Trust. Julian is the primary trustee for the Harringtons. They're one of his firm's biggest clients. He's skimming, Arthur. He's not just speculative trading, he's embezzling from his clients to fund the aesthetic Vivian demands. The room seemed to tilt. My son wasn't just a snob who was ashamed of his father. He was a criminal. He was a thief who had built a life of glass and marble on a foundation of stolen money. And he was using a poor man's co-signature on a secondary line of credit, the one I had signed for him 6 months ago, when he claimed he needed a safety net for a new business venture to bridge the gaps when his trades went south. He used me, I said, the realization cutting deeper than the rejection on the porch. He didn't just want my silence. He needed my low-profile credit history to hide the movements of his stolen funds. I was his camouflage. Arthur, Thaddeus said, if the Harringtons find out, he's looking at 20 years. And because you co-signed that line of credit, the feds will come for you too. They'll see a retired factory worker with an inexplicable connection to a Cayman shell. They'll think you're the mastermind and he's the bagman. The trap was perfect. Julian hadn't just kicked me out of his life. He had tethered his sinking ship to my neck. He assumed I was too old, too simple, and too technologically illiterate to ever see the strings. He thought his aesthetic was safe because the man who built it was supposed to be invisible. How long do we have? I asked. The Harringtons do their annual audit in the second week of January, Thaddeus replied. He's frantic, Arthur. That business social he's throwing today? It's not a party. It's a desperate play to court new investors to cover the hole in the Harrington account before the auditors arrive. He's trying to find a new mark. I stood up, walking to the window. In the distance, the lights of the Greenwich Hills twinkled a world of beauty built on ugly secrets. Julian thought he was playing a high-stakes game. He thought he was the smartest man in the room because he had a tailored suit and a cold wife. He didn't know that the poor old man in the Ford F. Matrum Mui was the architect of his entire world. Thaddeus, I said, my voice as hard as the steel I used to forge. Call the bank. Freeze the line of credit I co-signed. Do it now. Don't give them a reason. Just cite potential identity compromise. And the Apex mortgage? Yes? Send the notice, I said. Not a late payment reminder, a full notice of default. Cite the illegal source of funds. We have a clean hands clause in that contract he never bothered to read. Give him 48 hours to vacate, or we initiate immediate foreclosure. Arthur, it's 3 days before Christmas. The optics will be. The aesthetic will be perfect, I interrupted. He wanted a private, inner circle Christmas? Let's give him exactly that. No house, no credit, no camouflage. Just him, his wife, and the truth. I hung up. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. I was about to destroy my own son. But Julian had destroyed himself the moment he decided that a person's worth was measured by the look of their life rather than the content of their soul. I looked at the dollhouse sitting on the workbench upstairs. It was a replica of a home built on honesty, hard work, and actual love. Julian's house was a cage, and I was about to open the door and let the cold in. I didn't know it yet, but Vivienne was more involved than even Thaddeus suspected. She wasn't just the demanding wife. She was the one holding the map to the Cayman accounts. And she had a plan B that involved making sure I never lived to see the new year. I sat back down at the table and waited. My phone began to ring again. This time, it wasn't Julian. It was Penelope. I hesitated, my heart breaking for the 8th time that day. I picked up. Grandpa? Her small, sweet voice whispered. Are you coming back? Mommy threw your house in the garage. She said it was trash, but I want to see the tiny shutters again. Please, Grandpa. It's lonely here. I closed my eyes, a single tear escaping. I'm not far, sweetheart, I whispered. I'm not far at all, and I promise you, before Christmas is over, you're going to have a real home again, one that no one can ever throw away. I hung up, and the ice in my heart solidified into a weapon. The game was no longer just about revenge. It was about a rescue. The phone call with Penelope left a ringing silence in the kitchen that was louder than any shouting Julian could have managed. I stared at the blank screen of my phone, the small end call notification mocking me. Vivienne had thrown her gift in the garage. She had called 6 months of my craftsmanship and a lifetime of Eleanor's memory trash. I didn't get angry. I got focused. I spent the next 4 hours in my basement command center. The cool, conditioned air, a sharp contrast to the humid rage simmering in my gut. Thaddeus was right. The paper trail was a labyrinth, but I had built the walls of that maze decades ago. I knew where the bodies were buried because I had dug the graves. Julian's business social was likely reaching its peak. I could imagine the scene, the clinking of baccarat crystal, the smell of expensive catering, and Julian sweating through his cashmere as he tried to secure one last mark to cover his theft. He thought he was playing for high stakes in Greenwich. He didn't realize the table had been flipped before the first drink was even poured. "Arthur?" Thaddeus's voice came through the secure speaker, sounding tired but triumphant. "I've finished the cross-reference. It's worse than the embezzlement. Julian isn't just skimming from the Harringtons. He's been using the Oak Ridge property as collateral for a series of high-interest private loans that aren't on any official bank ledger. He's into some very dark money. Arthur. People who don't wait for an audit to collect." "How much?" I asked, my voice flat. $700,000, on top of the $200,000 from your line of credit, and the $1 million he owes the Harringtons. He's nearly $2 million in the red, and he's been using Vivienne's family name as the ultimate guarantee. If her parents, the Kensingtons, find out their reputation is being used to back predatory loans, they'll disown her before the sun goes down. I leaned back, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. So that's why he needed me gone. He wasn't just embarrassed by my truck. He was terrified I'd noticed the renovations he claimed he was doing were actually just him stripping the house for parts. He's been selling off the high-end fixtures, the art, even the copper piping in the guest house, and replacing them with cheap knockoffs to maintain the look. "The ultimate aesthetic," Thaddeus remarked dryly. "A palace made of cardboard and stolen dreams." "Call the bank again," I said. "I want the freeze on that line of credit moved from suspicious to confirmed fraud. And Thaddeus, send the default notice for the house via a private courier. I want it delivered directly to the front door in the middle of the party, not to Julian, to Vivienne." "Arthur, that's a public execution." "No," I replied, standing up. "That's a reality check. He wants to live in a world of appearances. Let's show the world what's really behind the curtain." I left the warehouse and drove toward Waterside. I needed to see someone Julian would never expect me to know. An old contact from the logistics days, a man who dealt in information the way I dealt in freight. As I drove, I saw the familiar gates of Julian's neighborhood on the horizon. He thought he was safe behind those stone walls. He thought that because he was a Sterling, the rules didn't apply. He had forgotten the lesson I tried to teach him every summer on that factory floor. The machine only works if every gear is honest. If one tooth breaks, the whole thing grinds to a halt. I pulled into a nondescript parking lot near the docks. A man was waiting by a shipping container, smoking a cigarette. He looked at my truck, then at me, and nodded. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's been a long time. I heard your boy was making quite a name for himself in the creative accounting world." "I need the list, Silas," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "The people he's borrowing from, the ones off the ledger." Silas handed me a manila envelope. "You're not going to like it, Arthur. They aren't the type to care about aesthetics. They care about vig. And they're getting impatient. They were told the payout was coming after the Christmas miracle Julian was promising his investors today." I opened the envelope. My eyes scanned the names. It wasn't just business. It was a death spiral. Julian had entangled himself with a group of offshore investors who were little more than high-tech lounge sharks. And he had used my name, my real name, the one he thought I'd buried as the final assurance of his liquidity. He hadn't just stolen my credit. He had stolen my identity to back his crimes. "Thank you, Silas," I said, handing him a roll of cash. "You going to stop him, Arthur, or let him drown?" I looked at the water, the dark Atlantic waves slapping against the pier. "I'm going to do what I should have done 20 years ago. I'm going to teach him that you can't build a life out of shadows." I got back in my truck. I had the evidence. I had the default notice on its way. And I had the names of the people who were about to come knocking on his glass doors. I checked my watch. Born. Home PM. The party would be in full swing. The Kensingtons would be holding court. And my son would be standing at the center of it all, oblivious to the fact that the man he called trash was about to burn his museum to the ground. I didn't know it yet, but Vivienne had already seen the courier arrive. And instead of panic, she had a much more calculated response. She wasn't going to let Julian go down alone. She was going to make sure the poor old man was the one the police found with the missing Harrington funds. As I drove toward the estate one last time, my civilian phone buzzed again. A text from Julian. "Dad, I'm sorry about earlier. I was stressed. Please, come back. We need to talk. Alone. I have something of Mom's I want to give you." It was a trap. I knew it the moment I read it. He didn't have anything of Eleanor's. He had a hole in his life that only my silence could fill. "I'm coming, Julian," I whispered, gripping the steering wheel. "But I'm not coming alone." I dialed Thaddeus. "Call the authorities. The Harrington audit starts tonight. And tell the law offices of Robert Vincent Siska, Associates, LLC, that their senior partner is about to have a very public career change. The game was entering the final turn. And for Julian and Vivienne, the aesthetic was about to get very, very ugly. The sleet had turned into a heavy, wet snow by the time I reached the outskirts of Greenwich. The festive lights draped over the downtown storefronts looked like blurred embers in the gray twilight. My civilian phone buzzed once more, another text from Julian, practically pleading now. I shoved the device into the glove box. I didn't need his words. I had his ledger. I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet diner in Stamford, just a few miles from Julian's glass fortress. I wasn't there for the coffee. I sat in the dim light of the cab, watching the entrance. 5 minutes later, a black sedan pulled in beside me. Thaddeus Vance stepped out, clutching a weatherproof briefcase. He climbed into the passenger seat of my truck, his face etched with a grim satisfaction. "The courier just confirmed delivery," Thaddeus said, handing me a tablet. The default notice was handed directly to Vivienne Montgomery Sterling at Bourne, Muihai PM. According to the courier, she didn't scream. She didn't faint. She just walked back inside and closed the door. "That's Vivienne," I muttered, scrolling through the live updates on Julian's accounts. "She doesn't panic. She recalibrates. She's already looking for a way to turn this into someone else's fault. Well, she's going to have a hard time with this," Thaddeus noted, pointing to a new line of data. "We tracked the consulting fees she's been receiving from Viridian Alpha. She wasn't just aware of the Cayman shell, Arthur. She's the one who set it up. She's been funneling Julian's stolen Harrington funds into a separate account in her maiden name. She was planning to leave him the moment the audit hit." I felt a coldness in my chest that had nothing to do with the Connecticut winter. My son was a thief, but his wife was a predator. They were two scorpions in a bottle, and they had been using me as the glass. "The Kensingtons?" I asked. "They're still at the party," Thaddeus replied. "But the Harrington estate audit I triggered has already reached the firm's managing partner. They've sent a private security detail to Julian's house to secure his company laptop and files. They'll be there within the hour." I looked at the clock. Numb. Combe, PM. The business social was about to become a crime scene. I put the truck in gear. "It's time to go home, Thaddeus. Arthur, the police are already en route. You don't need to be there." "Yes, I do," I said, my voice like iron. I need to see the look on his face when he realizes that the trash he threw in the garage is the only thing that could have saved him. We drove in silence toward Old Greenwich, the tires crunching through the deepening snow. As we approached the gates of Oak Ridge Estates, the security guard, a man I'd tipped generously for years to keep my poor man act believable, simply nodded and waved us through. He knew something was happening. The air felt heavy with the coming storm. As we rounded the final curve, Julian's house came into view. It was glowing like a radioactive lantern against the dark woods. I could see the silhouettes of people through the massive glass walls, men in tuxedos, women in gowns, all clutching champagne flutes. It looked perfect. It looked expensive. And then, the first crack in the aesthetic appeared. A black SUV pulled into the circular driveway, blocking the entrance for the late arrivals. 4 men in dark suits stepped out, not police, but the firm's internal security. They didn't ring the bell. They walked straight to the side entrance. I parked my truck on the street, right behind the shiny Bentley Julian had boasted about. Thaddeus and I stepped out into the cold. "Wait here," I told him. "If things get ugly, call the precinct directly." I walked up the heated cobblestone path. I didn't have a tuxedo. I didn't have a brand. I just had the truth. I reached the massive pivot door and pushed. It wasn't locked. The foyer was a cathedral of marble and white light. The scent of pine and expensive perfume hit me like a physical blow. In the main salon, I saw Julian. He was standing with an older couple, presumably the Kensingtons, laughing at something the man had said. He looked triumphant. He looked like he had just closed the deal of a lifetime. Then he saw me. The laughter died in his throat. The color drained from his face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug. He stumbled back, nearly knocking over a pedestal holding a modern art sculpture. "Dad?" he stammered, his voice carrying across the silent room. "What are you? You can't be here." Vivienne appeared from the crowd, her face a mask of cold fury. She was holding the default notice in one hand, crumpled into a ball. "Julian, deal with this. Now, I told you. I'm not here for the party, Vivienne," I said, my voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. I looked at the guests, the power players of New York City, who were now staring at the old man in the work jacket. "I'm here for my house." "Your house?" the older man Kensington asked, his brow furrowed. "Julian, what is this man talking about? This is a private residence." "Actually, George," I said, stepping into the center of the room, "it's a corporate asset. And as of 40 minutes ago, the lease has been terminated due to criminal misuse of funds." Julian lunged toward me, his eyes wild. "Shut up! You're senile! You're confused! Security!" The 4 men from the law firm stepped into the room. They didn't move toward me. They moved toward Julian. "Mr. Sterling," the lead security officer said, his voice flat and professional. "We have a court order to seize all firm-issued hardware and documents. We also have a notification from the district attorney's office. You are under investigation for felony embezzlement." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Vivienne stepped back, her eyes darting toward the stairs, toward the exit, toward anywhere but her husband. "It's a mistake," Julian shrieked, looking at the Kensingtons. "He's doing this. My father. He's jealous. He's crazy." I looked at my son, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of pity. He was drowning in his own lies, still trying to grab the aesthetic as he went under. "I'm not the one who stole from the Harringtons, Julian," I said softly. "And I'm not the one who used a Cayman shell to hide the blood money." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small brass key to the dollhouse I had built. I walked over to the marble fireplace and set it on the mantel. "I built you a real home once," I said. "But you wanted a museum. Well, now the museum is closed." Before he could respond, the front door swung open again. This time, it was the police. I didn't stay to watch the handcuffs go on. I turned and walked toward the garage. I had one more thing to do. I had to find Penelope. I didn't know it yet, but Vivienne hadn't just thrown the dollhouse in the garage. She had hidden something inside it, the hard drive containing the encryption keys to the Cayman accounts. She had planned to frame me for the whole thing, and she was about to realize that I wasn't the only one who knew how to build a trap. The chaos behind me was a symphony of falling glass and shattered pretenses. I could hear Vivienne's voice rising to a shrill, hysterical pitch as she tried to distance herself from Julian, and the low, authoritative murmurs of the detectives beginning their work. But I didn't care about the arrest. I didn't care about the Kensingtons or the social death of my son. I was moving through the shadows of the house, heading for the one place Vivienne considered the cellar of her life, the sprawling, 4-car garage. The transition from the heated marble of the foyer to the cold, concrete floor of the garage was like stepping into a different dimension. The air here was thin and smelled of gasoline and expensive leather. Julian's vintage Porsche sat under a silk cover, a toy he couldn't afford, bought with money that didn't belong to him. I found her in the far corner, huddled on a stack of unopened moving boxes. Penelope was still wearing her birthday dress, a frilly, pink thing that looked absurd against the backdrop of industrial shelving. She was clutching her knees to her chest, her small shoulders shaking with silent, rhythmic sobs. And next to her, shoved unceremoniously between a leaking bag of lawn fertilizer and a discarded tire, was the dollhouse. My heart didn't just break, it hardened into something sharper. The blue shutters I had spent hours painting were chipped. One of the tiny cedar shingles had been ripped off, likely when Vivienne had kicked it across the room. It sat there, a masterpiece of memory treated like refuse. "Penelope," I whispered. She looked up, her face streaked with tears and dirt. When she saw me, she didn't just run. She launched herself at me. I caught her, my old bones groaning under the weight of her grief. I held her tight, feeling the coldness of her hands against my neck. "Grandpa, they're taking Daddy," she sobbed into my jacket. "And Mommy told me to stay here," she said. "She said we're going on a long trip, and I can't take anything with me. She told me to leave the little house in the trash." "You're not going on a trip, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick. "And this house? It's not trash. It's the only thing in this whole building that's real." I pulled back and looked at the dollhouse. Even in the dim light of the garage, I could see that something was wrong. The floorboards of the miniature master bedroom, the ones I had modeled after the room where I held Eleanor's hand for 40 years, were slightly askew. They were raised, as if someone had pried them up with a screwdriver. I knew my own work. Those boards had been flush when I brought it to the porch. I reached out, my calloused fingers trembling slightly, and gently pressed on the floor of the tiny house. It clicked. A false bottom I hadn't built. I pulled the wood back, and there, nestled in the hollow space, was a sleek, silver M high hard drive. I didn't know it yet, but I was holding the literal key to my own destruction, or my salvation. Looking for something, Arthur? The voice was like a razor blade. I didn't need to turn around to know it was Vivienne. I felt Penelope stiffen in my arms. I turned slowly, shielding the girl behind my back. Vivienne was standing by the internal door, the light from the house framing her like a vengeful ghost. She wasn't crying anymore. The victim mask had been discarded. In its place was a cold, calculating creature who had realized that the only way to survive the fire was to make sure someone else burned in her place. "You shouldn't have come back, Arthur," she said, her voice eerily calm. She held a smartphone in her hand, the screen glowing. "I've already made the call. The police are inside, but they're looking for Julian. What they don't know yet is that the mastermind behind Viridian Alpha isn't the son, it's the father." I looked at the hard drive in my hand, then back at her. "You put this here." "I did," she said, taking a step toward me. Her heels clicked on the concrete like a countdown. "Julian is a weak, pathetic little boy. He was easy to lead. He did the stealing, sure. But I made sure the digital trail leads directly to your poor man's bungalow. That drive in your hand contains the encryption keys for every illegal transfer, all signed with your digital fingerprint. By the time I'm done, the world will think you were using your own son as a shield while you built your secret empire." "You'd frame the father of the man you claim to love?" I asked. "Love?" She let out a short, jagged laugh. "I loved the Sterling name. I loved the lifestyle. But Julian has ruined that. He's a liability now. But you're a goldmine. If I hand the feds the mastermind who corrupted a promising young lawyer, I get immunity. I get to keep the Cayman accounts, and I get to walk away with Penelope." Penelope gripped my hand tighter. "No," she cried. "Hush, Penelope." Vivienne snapped, her eyes flashing with a terrifying intensity. "Grandpa is going to prison for a long, long time. Now, Arthur, hand me the drive. If you give it to me now, I'll make sure Penelope gets to visit you once a year. If not, I'll make sure you never see her face again." I looked at the drive. I looked at the dollhouse. Then I looked at the security camera in the corner of the garage, the one Julian had installed to protect his cars, the one he had bragged was unhackable. What Vivienne didn't know was that Thaddeus Vance hadn't just been auditing accounts. He had been ghosting the home's security network for the last 48 hours. "You think you're the only one who knows how to build a narrative, Vivienne?" I said, my voice dropping to that cold, boardroom hum. "You think because I wear this jacket and drive that truck I've forgotten how the world works?" I held up the drive. "This is the smoking gun you were going to use to bury me. But there's a problem with your aesthetic, Vivienne. It's too perfect. You assumed I was a senile old man who wouldn't notice a 3mm gap in his own handiwork." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own phone, the encrypted one. I hit a button. On the large wall-mounted monitor in the garage, used for Julian's smart home diagnostics, a video feed flickered to life. It was a recording from 2 hours ago. It showed Vivienne, still in her party dress, frantically prying up the floorboards of the dollhouse in this very garage. It showed her inserting the drive. It showed her face clear, sharp, and filled with a desperate, criminal intent. Vivienne's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. She lunged for the monitor, but she was too late. "Thaddeus has already mirrored this to the detectives inside," I said. "And the digital fingerprint you think you created? You used Julian's home network to do it. A network that my company provided the hardware for. We have the MAC address of every device that accessed those accounts, Vivienne. And none of them belong to a bungalow in the rail yard." The door to the house burst open. It wasn't the law firm security this time. It was the actual police, led by a woman with a gold shield on her belt. "Vivienne Sterling?" the detective said, her voice echoing in the vast space. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and felony fraud." Vivienne didn't fight. She didn't scream. She just collapsed. The silk dress she had been so proud of, the aesthetic she had valued over her own family, was now just a crumpled pile of white fabric on a cold garage floor. As they led her away, She didn't look at Penelope. She didn't look at me. She was staring at the dollhouse, her eyes wide with a realization she should have had years ago. You can't build a life on a foundation you didn't earn. The garage became quiet again. Just the sound of the wind whistling through the door and the soft breathing of my granddaughter. I picked up the dollhouse, tucked it under one arm, and held Penelope's hand with the other. "Come on, sweetheart," I said. "Let's get out of here." "Where are we going, Grandpa?" I looked toward the street, where my old Ford was waiting. Thaddeus was standing by the door, his phone held to his ear, likely finalizing the takeover of Julian's remaining assets to ensure they were placed in Penelope's name. "We're going to a real house," I said. "One with a yard and a workshop, and shutters that will never be trash." I thought it was over. I thought the scorpions were in their cages. But as we walked toward the truck, I saw a black SUV idling at the end of the street. It wasn't a police car. It wasn't the firm's security. It was a vehicle I recognized from the list Silas had given me. The off-ledger investors. The ones Julian owed $2 million to. The ones who didn't care about audits or arrests. They weren't there for Julian. They were there for the money. And they knew exactly who was carrying the keys to the sterling fortune. I hadn't just won a war. I had just painted a target on my back. And the real nightmare was about to begin. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers were still pulsing against the snow-covered trees, casting a rhythmic, eerie glow over the driveway. To any passerby, it looked like the end of the story. The villains were in handcuffs, the child was safe, and the old man was walking away. But as I ushered Penelope toward my truck, I didn't feel the relief of a victor. I felt the cold, sharp prickle of a man who knows he's being watched by eyes that don't care about the law. The black SUV at the end of the cobblestone road didn't have its lights on. It sat there, a dark, idling predator, its exhaust blooming like a gray ghost in the freezing air. I knew that vehicle. Or rather, I knew the type of men who drove it. They were the ones Silas had warned me about, the off-ledger shadows who didn't file lawsuits. They filed obituaries. "Thaddeus," I said, my voice low and urgent as we reached the F-Mot Trum Num Mui. "Get Penelope into your car. Now. Don't go to the bungalow. Take her to the Harrison Plaza penthouse. Use the service entrance. Don't stop for anything." Thaddeus looked at the SUV, then back at me. He had been my lawyer for 40 years, but he had also seen the rougher side of the logistics business. He didn't ask questions. He scooped Penelope up, his face set in a grim mask. "Grandpa?" Penelope cried, her voice small and trembling. "I'll be right behind you, sweetheart." I lied. I hated lying to her, but the truth was a weight she couldn't carry. "Thaddeus is going to take you to a place with the biggest Christmas tree you've ever seen. Go on now." I watched them pull away. The black SUV didn't move to follow them. That was my first clue. They weren't interested in the girl. They weren't even interested in Julian anymore. They were here for the source. They were here for me. I climbed into my truck, but I didn't start the engine. I waited. If I tried to drive past them, they'd ram me into the ditch. If I stayed here, I was a sitting duck. I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in an oily rag, a memento from my days on the docks that I'd hoped I'd never have to use again. I tucked it into my waistband and stepped out of the truck. I walked toward the end of the driveway, my boots crunching on the ice. I wanted the police to see me, but they were busy processing the aesthetic crime scene inside. I was alone in the dark. The SUV's door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a leather trench coat that cost more than my truck, and he moved with the slow, arrogant confidence of a man who had never been told no. This was Jax Blackwood. I'd seen his name in the envelope Silas gave me. He was the head of a private investment firm that was really just a front for money laundering and predatory debt collection. "Arthur Sterling," Blackwood said, his voice a smooth, cultured purr that felt like a snake sliding through grass. "I must say, you play the part of the grieving, simpleton father quite well. Almost had us fooled." "The part is over, Blackwood," I said, stopping 10 feet from him. "Your client is inside in handcuffs. If you're looking for Julian, you're too late." Blackwood laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "Julian?" Julian was a flamboyant idiot, a mid-level distraction. We knew he was stealing. We encouraged it, actually. It made him easier to manage. He took a step forward, the light from the house catching the sharp, predatory lines of his face. "We aren't here for Julian's debt, Arthur. We're here for yours. I don't owe you a dime. Strictly speaking, you're right." Blackwood conceded, tilting his head. "But your son," he was very thorough. "When he realized he couldn't cover the Harrington hole, he didn't just borrow money. He sold us a future interest. Specifically, he sold us the deed to Sterling Vance Logistics. The ground seemed to move beneath my feet. That's impossible. I hold the voting shares. The company is in a blind trust. A trust that Julian had the power of attorney over, provided you were incapacitated, Blackwood said, his smile widening to reveal teeth that were too white, too perfect. He gave us the documents 3 weeks ago, notarized, witnessed, and filed. He even gave us a medical evaluation signed by a doctor we happened to put through medical school. It says you've been suffering from advanced Alzheimer's for years. The betrayal hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian hadn't just been planning to commit me to a nursing home. He had already sold the company my life's work, Eleanor's legacy, to a pack of wolves before he'd even set foot in the courtroom. He hadn't just kicked me off his porch, he had sold the ground I was standing on while I was still breathing. The petition for guardianship was dismissed this morning. I growled. The documents are void. In a court of law, perhaps, Blackwood said, reaching into his coat and pulling out a heavy, black-silenced pistol. He didn't point it at me yet, but the message was clear. But in my world, a signature is a signature. And right now, the only thing standing between us and the total liquidation of Sterling Vance is a very old man who is supposed to be incapacitated. If you were to, say, disappear in the middle of this tragic family scandal, well, the documents become much harder to dispute. I looked at the gun. I looked at the dark woods surrounding us. I was 70 years old. I had billions in the bank and a heart full of ice. And I realized that Julian had done more than steal my money. He had stripped me of the one thing I thought I had left, the belief that I had raised a son. Julian told us where you'd be, Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. He told us you were trash that needed to be hauled away. He actually suggested the location. The old warehouse on the docks? Very poetic. I felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. It wasn't fear. It was the old Arthur Sterling, the man who had fought his way out of the slums of Bridgeport and built an empire out of grit and blood. You made one mistake, Blackwood, I said, my voice steady, dangerously calm. And what's that, old man? You believed my son, I said. You believed the version of me he created because it made you feel powerful. You thought you were robbing a victim. I reached for my phone, the encrypted one, and hit a pre-programmed emergency sequence. Suddenly, the streetlights for the entire block of Oak Ridge Estates didn't just flicker. They exploded in a shower of sparks. The heated cobblestones beneath us hissed as the power grid surged. And then, the silence was broken by the thundering roar of heavy machinery. From the dark woods behind the SUV, 2 massive armored semi-truck Sterling Vance rigs burst through the brush, their high beams blinding Blackwood and his driver. They didn't stop. They slammed into the front and back of the SUV, pinning it like a crushed tin can between 40 tons of American steel. Blackwood stumbled, blinded by the light. I didn't wait. I moved faster than a 70-year-old man had any right to. I pulled the heavy wrench from my waistband and swung. I didn't hit him in the face. I hit the hand holding the gun. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the silenced pistol thudded into the snow. Blackwood let out a strangled cry, clutching his shattered hand. I kicked the gun away and grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive coat, slamming him against the side of my Ford. I didn't just build a logistics company, you son of a bitch, I hissed into his ear. I built the infrastructure of this state. I know every wire, every pipe, and every man who drives a rig from here to Boston. You thought I was trash? I'm the landfill. The drivers of the rigs, men who had worked for me for 30 years, men who knew the retired foreman was actually the king of the docks, hopped out of their cabs, carrying heavy iron bars. They didn't say a word. They just stood there, a wall of shadows. Tell your investors the deal is off, I said, leaning in close to Blackwood's trembling face. Tell them Julian Sterling has no authority. And tell them if I see so much as a shadow of a black SUV near my granddaughter again, I won't call the police. I'll call the excavators. And you'll find out just how deep a foundation can go. I threw him to the ground. He crawled toward his crushed vehicle, his aesthetic ruined, his power evaporated. My men watched him with cold, silent eyes. I stood there in the dark, the snow falling softly on my shoulders. I had won. But as I looked back at the house, Julian's house, I saw him being led out by the police. He was screaming my name. He looked at the trucks, he looked at the wreckage of Blackwood's car, and he saw me standing there. He didn't see a poor old man, he saw the stone. For a split second, our eyes met. He saw the truth that I had been watching him his entire life, that I had known his heart was hollow, and that I had let him destroy himself. The look of pure, agonizing terror on his face was the only gift I had left for him. "Checkmate, Julian," I whispered. I got into my truck and drove away. But the victory felt like ash. I had saved the company. I had saved Penelope. But I had lost my son a long time ago. I didn't know it yet, but the final twist was waiting for me at the penthouse. Thaddeus hadn't just taken Penelope there for safety. He had found something in the Harrington files, a secret Eleanor had kept from me for 40 years. A secret that changed the meaning of every dollar I had ever earned. The silence of the penthouse was worse than the roar of the trucks. I stepped out of the elevator and into a world of brushed steel and panoramic glass, the lights of the city stretching out like a carpet of cold diamonds. Thaddeus was standing by the window, his back to me. Penelope was asleep on an Italian leather sofa, wrapped in a blanket that cost more than my first truck. I walked over to her, gently brushing a stray hair from her forehead. She looked so much like Eleanor it made my chest ache. "She's safe, Arthur," Thaddeus said, his voice unusually soft. He didn't turn around. "The building has private security on every floor. Blackwood won't get within 3 blocks of here." "I know," I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Thank you, Thaddeus, for everything." "Don't thank me yet." He finally turned around. He wasn't holding a drink. He was holding a yellowed, legal-sized envelope. His face was pale, his eyes filled with a kind of pity that I had never seen in all our years of business. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my ribs. I had just survived a cartel-style hit and dismantled my son's life. But the look on Thaddeus's face made me feel more vulnerable than Blackwood's gun ever could. "What is it?" I asked. "Is there more debt? Did Julian hide something else?" "It's not about the debt, Arthur. It's about the Harrington files." When I was digging through Julian's private vault at the firm to find the embezzlement evidence, I found a secondary compartment. It didn't contain financial records. It contained these. He handed me the envelope. I opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter, written in the elegant, flowing script I had seen on 1,000 grocery lists and birthday cards. Eleanor's handwriting. My breath hitched. The letter was dated 2 weeks before she passed away. I began to read, and the world as I knew it, the 70 years of struggle, the factory floors, the billion-dollar logistics empire, the very identity of Arthur Sterling began to dissolve into ash. "My dearest Arthur," the letter began. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. I have lived my life with one great secret, a weight I thought I could carry to the grave to protect the peace we built. But as the end nears, I see Julian becoming a man I do not recognize. He has a hunger in him, Arthur, a coldness. He looks at you not with love, but with a strange, aristocratic resentment. I fear the truth is finally coming to the surface in his blood." I stopped reading, my vision blurring. I looked up at Thaddeus, but he just gestured for me to continue. "Before we met, when I was a young girl working as a maid for the Harrison family, I was foolish. I was enamored with the world of old money. There was a man, a visitor from the Kensington estate. It was one night, Arthur, a mistake born of loneliness and a desire to be seen. I never told you because when I met you, I saw a real man. I saw the stone. I wanted Julian to be a Sterling. I wanted him to have your grit, your heart. But as he grows older, I see George Kensington in his eyes. I see the vanity. I see the greed. He is not yours, Arthur. He never was." The letter fell from my hands, fluttering to the marble floor like a dead bird. Attached to the back of the letter was a DNA test, conducted in secret 20 years ago when Julian was in college. The results were AH-cum-fun-trum match. I sat down in a chair, the air leaving my lungs in a long, rattling hiss. 40 years. I had spent 40 years of my life raising a ghost. I had built a kingdom for a son who was sired by the very man who had just stood in Julian's foyer, looking down his nose at my work boots. Julian wasn't a Sterling. He was a Kensington. The aesthetic he was so obsessed with, the brand he valued over my life, wasn't just a choice. It was his birthright. He had spent his life subconsciously trying to return to a world he didn't know he belonged to, and I had spent my life trying to save a soul that wasn't mine to begin with. I didn't know it yet, but the betrayal was even deeper. Julian had found this letter. He had known for 5 years. He hadn't told me because he needed the Sterling fortune to buy his way into the Kensington circle. He was using my blood, my sweat, and my name to pay for a seat at his biological father's table. He knew, I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. That's why he was so comfortable framing me. He didn't see me as his father. He saw me as a bank he could finally liquidate. "I'm so sorry, Arthur," Thaddeus said. "The timing. It's monstrous." I looked over at Penelope, still sleeping peacefully. My mind raced. If Julian wasn't a Sterling, then Penelope. "She's still your granddaughter in every way that matters, Arthur," Thaddeus said, sensing my thought. I stood up. The shock was passing, replaced by something much colder, much more dangerous. The stone wasn't just a name I took to hide. It was who I was. And if I wasn't Julian's father, then I owed him nothing. No mercy. No protection. No legacy. "Thaddeus," I said, my voice as sharp as a razor. "Change the plan. Change it how?" I was going to let him serve his time and leave him a small trust for when he got out. A chance to rebuild. That's over. I walked over to the window, looking down at the city. I want him erased. I want every asset he touched, the cars, the art, the clothes sold at public auction. I want the proceeds donated to the factory workers' pension fund. And the Kensington connection? I want it leaked. I want the world to know that the great Julian Sterling is a bastard of the house he was so desperate to impress. I want him to have nothing, not even his name. "And Penelope? She is a Sterling," I said, looking at her. "She's the only one left. I'm taking her away from all of this. We're going to the house I built, the real one." The next morning, I went to the holding cell. I didn't go as the poor old man. I went as Arthur Sterling, chairman of Sterling Vance. I wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Julian's entire wardrobe, and I walked with the stride of a man who owned the building. When the guard led Julian into the visitation room, he looked like a broken toy. His cashmere sweater was stained, his hair was a mess, and his eyes were red from crying. When he really saw me, he froze. "Dad?" he croaked. You look different. Did you talk to the lawyers? Did you pay the bail? You have to get me out of here." "Vivienne," she told them everything. "She's crazy, Dad. You have to help me." I sat down, leaning forward until our faces were inches apart. The glass between us felt like a thin sheet of ice. "I found the letter, Julian," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. The frantic energy in Julian's eyes died instantly. His face went flat, the aesthetic finally crumbling into the truth. He didn't deny it. He didn't cry. He just stared at me with a cold, aristocratic detachment. "So you know?" he said, his voice no longer pleading. It was clipped, hollow. "I suppose that changes things." "It changes everything," I said. "I spent 40 years thinking I was protecting my son. I thought your greed was a flaw I could fix. But it wasn't a flaw. It was your nature. You were never a Sterling. You were just a long-term investment that failed." Julian let out a short, bitter laugh. "A Sterling? You mean a man who smells like diesel and counts his pennies? I was born for more than that, Arthur. I saw the way George Kensington lived. I saw the power. I deserved that life. You were just the man holding the keys. The keys are gone, Julian. I've liquidated the Oak Ridge property. I've frozen the trust. And I've informed the Kensingtons of your heritage." I smiled, and I saw the first flicker of real terror return to his eyes. "George Kensington told my lawyers that he has no interest in a felonious mistake from his past. He's disowned you before you even had a chance to ask." Julian lunged at the glass, his hands clawing at the surface. "You can't do this. I'm your son. You raised me. You owe me." "I owe you exactly what you gave me," I said, standing up. "Nothing." I turned to walk away, but I stopped at the door. "Oh, and Julian? I found the hard drive Vivienne hid in the dollhouse, the one with the Cayman keys. I didn't give it to the police." He looked at me, hope blooming in his eyes like a weed. You're going to use it to get me out?" "No," I said. "I'm going to use it to fund Penelope's future. Every cent you stole, every cent you embezzled. It's going to make sure she never has to know a man like you. You're going to prison as a pauper, Julian. And when you get out, you won't be a Sterling. You won't be a Kensington. You'll just be a man who ruined his own aesthetic." I walked out of the prison and into the bright, cold sunlight of Christmas Eve. My truck was waiting, the dollhouse strapped securely in the back. I felt lighter than I had in decades. The lie was dead. The stone was free. I drove back to the penthouse to pick up Penelope. We were going to the hill country. We were going to start over. But as I pulled into the garage, my phone buzzed with a private alert from the warehouse. Someone had broken into the command center. Someone who knew exactly where the biometric scanner was. I checked the feed. It wasn't Blackwood. It wasn't the police. It was a woman in a white silk dress, her face bloodied, but her eyes burning with a familiar, lethal ambition. Vivienne had escaped custody, and she wasn't looking for the money anymore. She was looking for the only person who could still give her a plan B. I realized then that the scorpions hadn't been in a bottle. They had been in my house. And Vivienne was about to play her final card, a card that involved a secret even Eleanor didn't know. The drive to the warehouse felt like a descent into a nightmare I had already lived through once. The snow was a white veil, obscuring the road, blurring the line between the world of the living and the ghosts of my past. I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles were white stones. Vivienne had escaped. She was in my sanctuary. My mind raced through the security protocols I'd spent millions to perfect. She didn't just break in. She had the codes. She had the biometrics. I thought of the Kensington letter sitting on the passenger seat. I thought of the 40 years of lies. And then I thought of the one thing Vivienne would be looking for in a command center designed to manage a billion-dollar empire. It wasn't the Cayman Keys I had those. It was the Genesis Ledger. The Genesis Ledger was the only physical record of every off-book deal, every silent partnership, and every political favor I had ever traded to build Sterling Vance. In the wrong hands, it wasn't just a book, it was a detonator for the entire New England economy. I pulled up to the warehouse. The side door was hanging open, the magnetic lock buzzing a pathetic, wounded sound. I didn't call the police. This wasn't a matter for sirens and paperwork anymore. This was between the stone and the creature who tried to hollow it out. I stepped inside. The air was frigid, the heating system disabled. I walked through the darkness of the dormant workshop, my footsteps silent on the sawdust-covered floor. I reached the reinforced steel door of the command center. It was open. The blue light of the monitors washed over the room, but the screens were flickering, showing system override in jagged red letters. Vivienne was sitting in my leather chair, her back to me. She was holding a glass of my Heimweh-Lumyear-old scotch, swirling it slowly. Her white silk dress was torn at the shoulder, stained with grease and dried blood, but her posture was as regal as ever. "You're late, Arthur," she said without turning around. "I expected you to be faster, but I suppose at 70, the legs start to go." "How did you get out, Vivienne?" I asked, my voice a low, lethal hum. She turned the chair. Her face was bruised, a dark purple welt across her cheekbone, but her eyes were burning with a terrifying manic clarity. "The Kensingtons don't like public scandals, Arthur. They have friends in the transport division. A quiet transfer, a mechanical failure of the van, and a waiting car. They didn't do it for me, of course. They did it because I told them I knew where the Genesis Ledger was." She set the scotch on the desk and picked up a heavy, leather-bound volume, the ledger. "They want their name erased from these pages, Arthur, and I want my life back." "You have no life back, Vivienne. You're a fugitive. You're a ghost." "Not if I have this," she said, patting the book. "With this, I don't need a sterling name. I don't need Julian. I can buy a new identity, a new aesthetic, in a dozen different countries. And as for Penelope, she's my daughter. I'll find her, Arthur. I'll find her and I'll teach her that the only thing that matters in this world is the power to make others blink first." I took a step into the room, the blue light catching the wrench I still had tucked in my belt. "You won't touch her." "Won't I?" Vivienne stood up, her eyes narrowing. "You think you're so smart, Arthur. The hidden billionaire, the stone, but you missed the biggest lie of all. You read Eleanor's letter, and you thought you were the victim. You thought Julian was the one who was sired by greed." She walked toward me, her heels clicking on the steel floor like the ticking of a bomb. "Eleanor didn't write that letter out of guilt, Arthur. She wrote it out of fear. She knew what you were. She knew that beneath that simple foreman act was a man who would crush anything that didn't fit his perfect, honest little world. She wanted Julian to have an escape. She wanted him to be a Kensington because she knew a Sterling would never be allowed to fail." I felt the air grow thin. "You're lying." "Am I?" "Check the vault, Arthur. The real vault. The one you built behind the dollhouse replica in the command center. The one even Julian didn't know about." I looked at the wall where a second, smaller replica of the bungalow sat on a pedestal, a prototype I'd made years ago. I walked over to it, my heart hammering. I pressed the tiny chimney. The wall behind it slid back, revealing a small, velvet-lined box. Inside wasn't money. It wasn't a ledger. It was a cassette tape, old and yellowed. I put it into the deck on the desk. The voice that filled the room wasn't Eleanor's. It was a man's voice, deep, cultured, and filled with a casual, devastating cruelty. "George Kensington. Listen to me. Eleanor." The voice recorded 20 years ago said, "The stone is becoming too powerful. He thinks he can control the docks. He thinks he can buy the waterfront. If you don't give me the leverage I need, I'll reveal what Julian really is. I'll destroy Arthur's aesthetic of the perfect family. I'll make sure the stone cracks. Then, Eleanor's voice, sobbing, broken. I'll do it. I'll write the letter. I'll tell him Julian isn't his. Just leave him alone. Let him have his quiet life. Don't let him know the monster you are. The tape ended with a hiss. I stood there, the world spinning. The letter wasn't a confession. It was a ransom note. George Kensington had used the threat of my own pride to keep Eleanor under his thumb for decades. He had manufactured the doubt, the biological lie, just to keep me from ever truly challenging his power in the city. Julian was mine. The DNA test Thaddeus found. He was a fake. A 20-year-old forgery planted in the Harrington files by the Kensingtons to ensure that if Julian ever fell, he'd take me down with him by shattering my heart. I looked at Vivienne. She was smiling. The Kensingtons always play the long game, Arthur. They knew you'd find that letter eventually. They knew it would break you. They just didn't expect me to find the tape first. She held up the Genesis ledger. Now, I'm leaving, and you're going to let me walk out of here. Because if you don't, I'll tell the world that the great Arthur Sterling spent his life hating his own son because of a lie he was too proud to double-check. I'll ruin your aesthetic of the wise, noble father forever. I looked at the monitors. I looked at the tape. And then, I looked at Vivienne. She thought she had won. She thought the truth was a weapon that would make me recoil. But she forgot one thing about a stone. You don't break it by hitting it with a lie. You only sharpen the edges. You're right about one thing, Vivienne. I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. I was a fool. I let my pride build a wall between me and the only thing that mattered. I reached for the keyboard. My fingers flew across the keys, entering the final burn protocol I had designed for the warehouse. What are you doing? Vivienne hissed, her smile faltering. I'm ending the aesthetic, I said. A series of small, controlled incendiary charges designed to protect the company's secrets in case of a hostile takeover detonated inside the server racks. Sparks flew as the monitors went black. The cooling fans shrieked and then died. The smell of burning plastic filled the air. The Genesis ledger is a copy. Vivienne, I said, stepping toward her. The real one was digitized and encrypted years ago. That book in your hand is just a prop. A decoy for thieves. I grabbed her by the arm, my grip like a vice. I didn't hit her. I didn't need to. I led her to the door, the fire beginning to roar in the server room behind us. The Kensingtons are finished, I said. Thaddeus isn't just a lawyer. He's a forensic accountant. He's been sending the real evidence, the tape, the forgery, the extortion to the Attorney General for the last hour. By morning, George Kensington won't be looking for a legacy. He'll be looking for a bail bondsman. I pushed her out into the snow. The police sirens were finally audible in the distance, a rising tide of justice. Vivienne stumbled into the white drifts, the fake ledger falling from her hands and being swallowed by the slush. She looked back at the warehouse, the smoke pouring out of the vents. She had nothing. No money, no leverage, no brand. I walked to my truck. I didn't look back at the fire. I didn't look back at her. I had a son to save. It took 6 months to undo the damage. Julian was still in prison, the embezzlement was real, and he had to pay for that, but the elder fraud and the conspiracy charges were dropped. The state recognized the extortion, the psychological warfare the Kensingtons had waged on our family. I visit him every week. We don't talk about aesthetics. We don't talk about brands. We talk about the factory. We talk about Eleanor. We talk about how to be a Sterling. It's a slow process, a hard one. The stone is still there, but the ice has finally melted. As for Penelope, she lives with me now. Not in a museum, not in a glass monument. We live in the hill country, in the house I built, the real one. The workshop is always open, the smell of cedar and pine filling the rooms. On the mantel, next to a photo of Eleanor, sits the dollhouse. It's been repaired. The blue shutters are perfect. The shingles are tight. I've realized that a man's life isn't measured by the aesthetic he presents to the world. It's not about the marble foyers, or the tailored suits, or the million-dollar views. It's about the things you build when no one is watching. It's about the strength to protect the people you love, even from yourself. Julian will be out in 3 years. He'll have a job waiting for him on the factory floor, a real one. He'll start as a gear just like I did. And maybe, just maybe, he'll learn that the only thing worth owning in this world is your own name. I sat on the porch as the sun set over the valley, Penelope's laughter echoing from the garden where she was playing. I picked up a piece of oak and my carving knife. I had a new project, a birdhouse for the spring. The aesthetic was gone, The truth was finally home.